And that was Someday by Angela Roos. And I am Thomas Lynn, and for approximately the next hour, we will be coming to you with some radical analysis from Media Bridges, from which WVQC 95.7 LP FM is broadcasting today. And let me go ahead and, before we really get going, remind everybody that WVQC as a community radio station serves only to open its airwaves to responsible divergent points of view. The opinions expressed on this program do not reflect the views of WVQC Media Bridges, its staff, or its board of trustees. The opinions expressed reflect the views of the programmer or their guests. Thank you. And once again, this is Radical Analysis with Thomas Lynn, and shortly with Dr. Timothy Conolly from East Stroudsburg University. He'll be joining us on the line in a few moments, and today we will be discussing uh, theories around war, just and unjust. Probably going to use Michael Walzer, a prominent contemporary theorist, as a point of departure. Obviously, a topic whose relevance is all too often self-evident. So, as of the present day, the United States is involved in several wars. The most obvious being the war in Afghanistan, but also the now, in a sense, forgotten war in Iraq, which persists despite the notion that we will be departing from the specious notion that we will be departing from Iraq shortly, because that's not actually the case in virtue of a rather developed base network that we have there, notwithstanding the formal declarations. Um, so I'm kind of in limbo until we're waiting for Tim to call. I might point out, in addition to American involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, we also now, it is admitted, have developing. Oh, well, you know what? There's Mr. Conley. So hold on one second here. Hey, Tim.
Hey.
How's it going?
Good.
Good. Can you hear me well?
You sound a little bit faint.
How's that?
That's better.
That's better? All
Yeah.
right. You're coming through loud and clear.
Great.
Outstanding. I'm always a little hesitant at the beginning in virtue of the technical apparatus that confronts me in the soundboard. So, but I was just telling the listeners that you will be our guest today, Dr. Timothy Michael Conolly. So,
Thank you.
who's been on other occasions. We talked on one show about Confucius or Confucius, and then also we talked a little bit about questions around will. That one contentious show with the experiment.
Yes.
So,
Yes, we'll try to be nice to each other today.
Well, you're always nice, Tim. I'm the belligerent. So, but we will be taking up, broadly speaking, question of just war. But I thought probably Michael Walzer, since he's an important contemporary theorist, might be a point of departure. But just to get right into it, let me turn it over to you. Maybe you could provide us with some opening remarks on just war theory generally, and then maybe specifically Walzer's contribution.
Okay.
Does that sound fair, or?
Yeah, that sounds fair. Let's see where to begin. Well, in the series about war and ethics, there are three, and one of them is pacifism, which says, if there is a war, you can't have justice, right? So it's better not to have a war, right? The two things are just fundamentally incompatible. And then there is another theory that's called realism, which is sort of amounts to all is fair in love and war, right? Only forget the love part, right? All is fair in war. So the idea there is that once you're in a state of war, right, justice has to go out the window again, right? Because considerations of war trump considerations of justice, right? There's no justice in war. And the idea is that suppose two countries are fighting a war and they're evenly matched, the country that fights fair is going to lower its chances of winning, right? So the realist theory of war says what matters is winning, right? If you want to win, you cannot attempt to fight fair because that will just set you back. So that's realism. So basically realism and pacifism, they both say war and justice are incompatible, right? But at opposite ends of the spectrum. And just war theory, the third theory, usually it's viewed as some sort of intermediate, right? So it says that justice and war can coexist, right? You can both declare a war and be just in declaring or initiating a war, and then once you are within a state of war, you can wage a war justly. And also, you can end a war justly as too, although maybe that's been less important. Yeah, does that sound fair so far, Tom?
Yeah. That sounds fair. I mean, it never really struck me before until your description right now. The ironic consonance in perspective that abides between a pacifist account and a realist account.
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it?
That they both concede that war and the notion of justice are incompatible terms.
Yes,
It's
yes.
only that the pacifist does not then abandon a commitment to morality, whereas the realist will say that such a commitment is foolhardy.
Yes, that's exactly right. The way I teach this to my introductory philosophy students when we talk about war is I have two of them come up to the front of the room, and I have one of them play war and one of them play justice, right? And usually I pick a small circle to designate your society, right? And you have the student playing justice stand within that circle, right? And the one theory says that if war comes knocking at the door, right, you have to keep it out, right? Because if war gets in, justice will have to leave, right?
Yes.
And the other theory says if war comes into your society, right, you can let it in, but you actually have to kick justice out.
You have all these novel pedagogical tactics.
Right.
I must tell you that
Right.
like you also shared in another conversation that you sometimes have your students enact the beginning of World War One.
Simple, right?
So,
Simple. Yes, I give them each different flags representing the different countries involved, right? And it's quite complicated what happens. But
we don't want to get too far.
Yes, we don't want to
Yeah,
get too
sorry.
far afield.
I'm sorry.
But the idea that's maybe another question we could talk about is the question of who started a war is pretty complicated. But the idea with just war theory is that if you have justice standing within that circle that represents society and war comes a knocking, right, you can let war in and justice can stay in as well, right? They can both hold hands and peacefully coexist, so to speak. Right.
I'm
Right.
sorry. I've been remonstrated about my editorial laugh, but I refuse to desist from its usage. So
Yeah. Wow.
my editorial chuckle, right? Obviously, my own position is not entirely opaque on this matter, but anyway, so you were really going to be talking about the third term, I think, right? The term of just war theory, which itself can be broken, as to which you already alluded, into three broad segments, and that's the jus ad bello, jus in bello, and jus post bellum,
Yeah, yeah,
or
and
or ad
usually
bellum.
we keep the Latin pronunciation, so we say use ad bello, use in bellum,
Right. Sorry
use
about that.
use post
How
bellum.
philistine of me.
Yeah, yeah,
So
right. No, no, uh, yeah.
so
So use ad bellum just means justice in declaring war, and use in bello means justice in waging war. And usually in your standard just war theory, those are taken to be two separate, completely independent realms, right? So it's possible that a country that declares a war unjustly can still wage a war justly, right? And it's possible that a country that declares a war justly can still wage a war unjustly, right? And the justice involved or the injustice involved in initiating a war, it has no bearing on the justice involved in waging it, right? They're just separate things.
I
And
just want to.
that actually is debatable.
I was going to
Right?
say I just want to remark that while that sort of conceptual space is evident, I still think that the distinctions are can only hold tenuously at best.
Yes, yes. Well,
I
let me explain the reasoning for the distinction. Right, the reasoning is that the people who declare the war could be different from the people who are waging the war. Right. So suppose the people who declare the war are not actually fighting it themselves. Right, as is often the case. Right. The people who are directly fighting the war have no say in whether and when the war they're fighting is declared, right? So the idea is that ordinary soldiers are not to blame for, the declaration of war.
see.
They just have a duty to go and fight it, and the burden on them is to fight whatever the war they're fighting uh, as justly as possible, right? So there's a question. Walzer, in his book *Just and Unjust Wars*, he raises a question about Nazi foot soldiers, right? I mean, can a Nazi foot soldier be tried for some sort of war crime, assuming that he fights the war he's fighting with justice? Of course, he's fighting for the Nazis, right? So it seems morally problematic that he's fighting on the side of the Nazis. But the fact that he's fighting it justly seems like he should be commended at least for that, right? Yeah. So what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts? Should we blame the Nazi foot soldier who fights with justice?
Well, you see, there. I mean, it's very. This is actually, I think, a really crucial node in the structure of whatever theory about war one is going to advance, because it sort of reveals, I think, many of the presuppositions that often lie hidden. Namely, for example, the notion of state agency implies that the state or the nation state complex or whatever the political entity in question is has a kind of homogeneity to it. But this distinction gives a lie to that homogeneity or that notion of a singular agent, because there is an obvious distinction between the state authority and the soldiers that constitute the armed force.
Right, right.
And
So the idea is if you buy into that distinction, right, you should buy into the independence of justice in declaring war and justice in waging war. Yes.
so, and just to go, one step further, I think then we'll have to retreat, because then we had a conversation about this a little while ago, and you pointed out, well, then Tom, in a sense, it's not even really a question for you, and in a sense, it isn't a question for me, because the very organization to which I just alluded, the one in which we have an armed force that is constituted by people who, even though they are autonomous agents as individuals, they are compelled within that organizational complex to give up their sovereignty to that of the state authority, and thus their status as moral agents is compromised. To me,
Yeah.
that's absurd on the face, and indicates a moral bankruptcy in the very constitution of the nation state, which I would argue is actually, or something like the nation state, that's not the only form of political organization, but that actually, I think, sort of gives the lie to the whole notion that war could be just in the first place, because war sort of requires for organizations like this to exist in order to occur. But
Yes, yes. Walter actually brings up the interesting fact that I believe it was during the Renaissance when wars were fought with mercenary armies. Do you think more mercenary soldiers died than in contemporary wars? Citizen soldiers die, or do you think less of them die?
citizen or mercenary, I would say citizen armies would be more liable to incur greater casualties,
Why would you say that?
because generally citizen armies are conscripted. They themselves are compelled by mere force to
Yes,
participate,
yes. So
and
that's actually the way he presents it, right? That's exactly correct, right? So when wars were fought with mercenary soldiers, mercenaries were expensive to hire and then to maintain. So he cites a couple of examples where battles were fought, and one soldier died, right? Because they didn't want to risk these very expensive troops, right? But once you have the advent of conscription, right, the term you're using for, I guess, the drafting of citizen soldiers, right,
mm-hmm.
or having citizen soldiers as volunteers, right, the number of casualties really took off, right,
And
right. Yes. So maybe it would be better if nation states could fight wars with entirely mercenary armies. Right.
I mean, I think that you're just sort of putting that in there kind of rhetorically, but because when you say that, I think on the face the absurdity of the notion becomes quite evident. Okay, but it's an interesting thing to
Yeah,
contemplate,
the
because
absurdity of which notion?
the notion that war should be undertaken by entirely mercenary complex.
Oh, right,
Okay,
right.
so
No, right. Yeah.
now it's kind of interesting for a few different reasons. One being that it's not just a little bit. It's just perhaps not entirely trivial that the major militaries of the world and the major military of the world is becoming increasingly privatized. But that's not the point I was going to stress. The
Right,
point I
but
was
if you
going to
look at casualties, right, the number of casualties isn't becoming, as you would say, privatized, right?
right, but the point I was actually going to raise was that when you consider a government hiring an entirely mercenary force to undertake some sort of war, it violates the notion that the war has something to do with state sovereignty and the interaction of state sovereignties. It seems that the citizenry must, in some way, be involved in the war itself, unless the pretense for the war is entirely inauthentic.
Right, right. So, but the idea with having the citizenry involved, right, is that you get this element of compulsion that you mentioned
Right.
earlier, right? Soldiers are fighting not because they choose to fight, right, but because they feel compelled out of duty or patriotism, or because of a draft, right, because of fear of imprisonment, right. So they are forced to fight, right. And Walzer actually says that this is the reason war is hell, right? Apart from whether any civilians die, right? War is hell because it forces soldiers to fight against their will, right? It takes away their autonomy.
Yes, and well, I mean, on that point, I would agree. Though I think I go in a different direction than he does with that point. I'm just really personally fascinated and detained by the degree to which the more one looks at the organizational prerequisites of the undertaking of war, the more one is struck by its fundamental incoherence as a strategy.
Yes, so tell me more what you mean.
the the romantic conception of a just war is one where you have a band of brothers assembled and fired by uh, great ideals to go out and commit great and stop some purveying menace. This is sort of the cartoonish version of World War II that we sometimes inherit. But when you look at crass and ugly reality, the crass and ugly reality is that you have a few old rich men telling very many more poor young men to go and kill very many other poor young men who were similarly subject to this coercion. Uh, they're going to go and they're going to kill each other. And I think it really defies reason
Yeah,
to
yeah.
suggest that somehow is a good thing.
Right.
So, okay.
So first, I'm not in total disagreement with that picture of war, but let me throw some things at you to challenge that. Right. So first of all, the fact that it is old men getting young men to fight seems like it has obvious reason, right? It's because young men are best prepared to fight, right? And the old men aren't.
Well,
it seems like the age is maybe
I was being
more rational than you portrayed it, right? And as for the wealth, right, I don't know that is necessarily true.
I would be surprised if you could produce a serious example where the authorities that motivated the undertaking of a war did not happen to be, if not, the same people who controlled the capital resources of a state, very intimately related to those
yes,
people.
Yes, but since that's a longer argument, right, and we probably won't see eye to eye on that, let me make the shorter argument, right? Probably some of the soldiers who have died in wars have been wealthy, right? They've not all been.
I would argue that the number of wealthy soldiers who have died in war, we don't actually have the resources to establish these. Okay,
right. But I'm just throwing this
statistically
out there.
negligible. That the vast majority of people who died in any given conflict are going to be are not going to belong to the wealthy or ruling classes. Okay, and I mean I really would, so like for example, the estimated American casualties in World War II, remarkable, really. 290, just shy of 300,000. Okay, and I really doubt that if you look at the demographic constitution of those roughly 300,000 dead men, that more than 5% of them belong to the upper 20% of the population economically construed. I mean, what I'm getting at, obviously, is the notion that one of the major things that actually drives war in the real world is greed, and the people who have the greatest interest in war are predominantly the wealthy. I mean, that's obviously the point at which I'm driving, but it's sort of apart from the question of whether or not you can have this abstract just war.
What about wars that drive a country to near bankruptcy?
I mean, but you see that actually is also in the interest of the wealthy, because the bankruptcy of the state more generally becomes the predicate term upon which the wealthy can hold the state more effectively in their thrall, and so that only serves to amplify rather than mitigate my point.
I have questions about the evidentiary standard of this argument, right? If war makes the state wealthy, it's proof of your point. If it makes them bankrupt, it's even more proof, right?
Well,
but we don't have to.
No, I mean, no, I don't want to back down there, Tim. I'm not going to back down, because that's part of the perverse manner in which the war machine is established. Is that it's like Lockheed Martin, for example, has just this isn't exactly the same thing, but just sort of as interesting, buttress to the point, has massive investiture in construction and also, ironically, in medical care industries. So, what Lockheed Martin does is motivate the destruction of societies and then goes and sends the same people into those societies to rebuild it so that they can make profit both in the development of the war machine itself, the actual implements of devastation, and in the recovery from that devastation. So Iraq is a case in point, actually.
No. Like I
All
said,
right.
I'm not unsympathetic to that.
Okay.
Right, and I think probably you are right about a lot of those things.
Now,
But that is,
but you
probably you could call that a relatively recent development.
I would.
I mean, the last
All right,
50 years.
I would. Well, I don't actually think that, but I think that it's something which has been very intimately involved with war virtually since its inception. But and obviously in other ways, not obviously in the same structural ways we see today. But as long as war has been around, which is a long time, it has consistently served the powerful, who also tend to be the people who control the material resources of a culture, while doing grave disservice to the powerless, those who generally stand in tangential relationship to the control of those self-same material resources. Now, we're
I'm not right. I'm not
okay.
unsympathetic.
So that being said, we want to get back to the question of the just war, because what I've sort of done is I've sort of moved into a territory where I'm talking about more explicitly historical occurrences. And in a way, you could divide the question of war per se from the question of the people who order those wars and what their actual motives
Yes,
are.
that's right. That's right.
And
So the
that's where
considerations you have been given are use ad bellum considerations, I think. Yes, or perhaps use post bellum.
Right. Well, which is interesting because those are actually very closely connected terms, something which can be made pretty apparent if you look at the relationship between World War One and World War Two. But let's get back to the use in bellum distinction, which is where we started way back then, right? We went from use in bellum,
use ad bellum, justice in declaring war.
right? Then we went to use in bellum, and then we talked
in bello,
yeah. Because then within use in bello, there's a distinction between the people who order the war and the people who fight the war, and that was the discussion about what that distinction portended is what filtered out into this discussion about So it's interesting how things flow in and out of each other. But I get this as you want to get back to use in bello.
Well, we could talk a little bit more about use ad bellum, right? So on Walser's theory of use ad bellum.
Why don't you go ahead and just give us a quick sketch of
yeah, a very quick sketch. So his idea is that there is this community of nations, right? That is sort of like a community of individuals, right? Only you would have to imagine a community of individuals where there's no police force, right? So a community of individuals in the absence of a police force, right? If one of those individuals commits some sort of crime against another individual, right? Who would you say has an interest in punishing the person who committed a crime?
Well, Tim, I'm not the best person to ask that question.
And you don't want to get roped in, right? You probably see where this is going, right?
When not even, well, you see, you've already sort of tried to hypnotically introduce certain, not you personally, but like I just found it fascinating that you say, well, you have a community of individuals who don't have a police force. So you see, that already is saying something about how people interact. Or,
no, right. You just
And
imagine a community of individuals like this without a police force, right?
right.
And suppose one individual attacks another individual. Uh, I think
You're going to
some
say
people some people would say,
here, I'll try and answer.
yeah, try
Okay,
and answer.
like the I mean, 2 points. One, personally, I think the strategy of punishment as a response is highly problematic, to
No,
put
no,
it
forget
mildly.
about
But
punishment. Forget about punishment.
you say everyone has an interest. Everyone in the community has an interest in the sustenance of peace among its members.
Yes, that's the idea. That's the idea. So here we are not arguing Walzer's theory yet. We're just sketching his theory, right? We're trying to understand what motivates it. Yes. So forget about punishment at this point, right? But just suppose one individual person is attacking another individual person, right? I think many people would say that not just the individual who is being attacked has an interest in fighting back, right? But any of the other members of this community of individuals have an interest in fighting back. So Walzer's idea is that there's a community of nations that is sort of like that, right? And just like individual people have rights, the nations have rights.
Right.
And he has a very complicated way of showing how the nation's rights are actually reducible to individual rights, right? So really, they're just individual rights. But
You mean by that?
let me tell you what they are. So the two rights of nations that he is primarily interested in are
Sovereignty and
which
territorial integrity.
Yeah, and territorial integrity, right? And he thinks both of those you can reduce them to individual rights.
What do you when you say individual rights? I'm just asking.
The right to the citizens that constitute
right.
that nation, right?
All
That's
right.
what I mean. So what he doesn't mean, and what I think he wants to avoid, is that there are these abstract entities, nations that bear rights, right? The rights are really borne by their citizens, right? Okay, so the nations, the individual nations that are members of this community have these two rights: sovereignty, which means the right to govern itself as it sees fit, and then territorial integrity, right? The right to maintain its borders. And war, the way he defines war, is the use of armed force that violates one or both of these rights. And he calls it aggression, right? That's one of the fundamental terms in his just war theory: aggression, using armed force to violate another country's rights.
This doesn't seem all too innovative. It sounds pretty much comparable to what was being asserted by people like Grotius and Montesquieu earlier, right?
Well, rights. I don't know that they would have talked about rights in the same way that Walzer talks about them, right?
Well, they were a little bit more honest, I think. But anyway, go on. So, I'm so naughty.
Yes, yes, you are. And so he says if a nation violates the rights of another nation, not just that nation has an interest in defending itself, but any nation can help it to defend itself, right? And not only to defend it, but then to punish the country that committed the initial act of aggression, right? So that's the basic theory of justice in declaring war, right? It seems very open-ended. But the idea is the only reason you can wage war and be just in doing so is aggression, right? Because of some initial act of aggression. You cannot do it for any other reason, right? You cannot do it because you want to convert the other country to your religion, right? You can't do it because you want to take their resources. Or if you do want to do those things, you have to at least pretend, or you at least have to be able to make the case, right? That there was an act of aggression. Okay, and then he discusses, some of these borderline cases like preemptive war or wars of humanitarian assistance that seem like they might be justly initiated without some initial act of aggression, right? So he has long discussions of those things as well. Let's see. Let's stop there for a minute and let me ask, what's your problem? I know you're going to have a problem with this, but can you pinpoint your problem?
Well, I mean, the problems I have already received some allusion in the discussion so far. It seems to me to be, first of all, it's kind of committing a fallacy of analogy. Again, it's treating these states as individuals in ways that I don't think can be uncontroversially admitted, despite the fact that we, are often wont to speak in this manner anyway. So that's one of my major problems.
That
It's kind of
might be more my fallacy, in trying to explain his theory than his own fallacy. Yeah.
I don't think so, Tim. But that's one problem I have, and then other problems have to do with the.
Let's stop with that one for a minute, right? So what exactly is the fallacy?
Well, there's the notion that the governments actually exist to preserve the rights of the people.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and I actually would be inclined to challenge that. All right, which I know is a strong point, but and one that's kind of outside of most conversations. All right, I would say the governments generally exist to make sure that insofar as the people actually practice their rights, they practice it in a manner which can be hemmed in, controlled, managed, so that those who have illegitimately accrued a disproportionate amount of power and material resource can continue to behave in the manners in which they behave.
Yeah, why have rights in the first place if that's the case?
It's a tricky little thing.
It's tricks.
Okay,
more tricks.
The reason it's tricky, Tim, is because you can both have rights and then you can have the concept of right illegitimately appropriated to provide a rhetoric which justifies their violation. Or to come at it somewhat differently, there is one way you can look about it is you say, well, what's the distinction between a right and a privilege? Right? And the distinction is that a privilege is something which can accrue to an individual if they undertake or establish certain prior conditions. If you do X, Y, and Z, then you get privilege A. But the question is begged, who determines the mechanism whereby the attainment of privilege is realized? And this is the point where you can have a gross disproportion of power become evident in a given society.
So what is the difference between a privilege and a right?
A right is supposed to be a special kind of privilege, which accrues to all the individuals in a society simply in virtue of their being members of that society.
Yes, okay.
The human society. But in fact,
no, you mean the citizenry of that society, right?
Well, yeah, I'm saying that absolute rights apply to the broadest society possible, the society of people who happen to be human beings.
Right, but here those are irrelevant, right? Here we just mean the rights of the citizens of a state, right?
Well, I was getting around to that. All right, because the point I wanted to make here, this sounds so terribly arid, okay, but that the right as a special kind of privilege doesn't fundamentally address the structural problematic that inheres in the constitution of a privilege. because who determines what the rights actually are? All right, and therein lies the rub. Who determines what the rights are is the answer to the question, where does power reside in a society? And that's why I say that the whole narrative structure of rights discourse doesn't actually solve the problem of power disequilibrium. Um, does that make sense?
Yeah, but let me ask a question, right? So who does determine where the rights where where the rights lie, and who gets them in Western liberal democracies?
Well,
In
there
your
is.
estimation, I mean.
Do you mean where are they supposed? Where is it alleged
No,
theoretically,
no,
or
we
who
know that, but
act
where on your view, right? Do you think?
in Western liberal societies, the determination of rights, accepted rights, I would contend, argue with the private property class.
Okay, okay. But then isn't it difficult to distinguish between a modern liberal democracy, right, and a you know uh, some sort of monarchy before the time of Christ?
I
You know.
would, but the significance of those distinctions become obviously far less significant. But that does not mean that that diminution isn't correct. In other words, the fact is, I think that the degree to which our contemporary ways of organizing polity is different from prior ways is greatly exaggerated.
Yeah. So I think this is an interesting point, Tom, and I remember we talked about this a little before, right? I mean, the question of initiating a war is maybe less separable from the question of how a society is structured, right? And the political nature of that society than we would like it to be, right? Or that just war theorists would sometimes pretend it is, right? So I think there's something to what you're saying, right? That's why war is really such a fascinating topic, right? Because it's related to everything, right? It's related to everything. So not just individual ethics, right? Should I support my government if I am an ordinary citizen, right? Or how should I wage a war if I am an ordinary soldier, right? But big political questions, right? About how society should be structured, and then also maybe even bigger questions about the future of humanity, right? What we're aiming for, right? Are we aiming for a good future for Americans, right? Or what are we aiming for a good future for all humanity, right? Are rights American rights, or are they, as you were saying earlier, human rights? Yeah. So what are we after? What are we after, right? And there are a whole host of other questions that I think are important, right? Questions about history, right?
Yes.
And questions also about anthropology, right? Is war part of the human condition, right? Or is it just a feature of the modern nation state, or the community of modern nation states, right? Yeah. So all of these questions are worth talking about. Yeah.
Right. I accord with everything that you said there, Tim. So, um, but
Let's see. So maybe 5 more minutes. Is there some particular issue you want to talk about? Then
what?
if it's longer than that, I will have to charge you for another hour.
Okay. Okay. No, I mean we can start wrapping it up. I'm just what I think is interesting, Tim, is so obviously I take a pretty hard line personally. You could say I could say that I'm a well here this is an interesting direction in which to go. The only sort of cases where, and I'm not endorsing this, okay, but because there's the question of war, and then there's which is the specific kind of violence, but then there's the question of violence. It's actually
Mhm.
distinct, okay,
Mhm.
and we might want to talk a little about fleshing that out. And it seems to me that the most persuasive arguments to be made for the use of violence to realize certain political ends uh, are cases that accrue to people who aren't actually state actors.
Oh, okay.
In other words, organizations, well, that's kind of problematic because in a way they're aspiring to be. I was going to say the IRA, but back in the day, not the current IRA, but no, I guess they're still around. The Irish Republican Army, or you could talk about the work of Franz Fanon and his, Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about how the violence of colonialism somehow necessitates a counter-violence that have a sort of purgative effect within the soul of the colonized. Or you can actually talk about insurgent. That's the word they use these days, but they're really, the rebellious efforts of people in Afghanistan or in Iraq to resist the imperial predations of the West. Or you could talk about the Viet Cong resisting the imperial predations of the West back in the 60s, 70s, and so forth. In other words, indigenous resistance guerrilla movement to resist imperial incursion seems to be the kind of violence which approximates being justified from where I stand. I don't think it's actually justified,
Mhm.
but I'm bringing it up just to discuss the case. And what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, well, yeah, violence is a very interesting concept, right? I'm not sure if you've heard this before, but the word violence, it is etymologically related to the word violate, right? Through some sort of Latin root, I can't recall exactly, right? So the question about the violence that I always have is maybe more theoretical, right? What is violated exactly? What is violated when somebody does violence? So in the cases you were talking about, right? In Walzer's case, right? He doesn't call it violence; he calls it aggression, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's violated are the rights of these sovereign uh, masses of territory, right? Nation states, right? So what is violated in the cases you're talking about?
Well, there, what you're actually witnessing in the cases that I'm discussing. See, I think it's. I'm not going to say it doesn't fit into Walder's perspective. I think you might be able to make it, but it's the concept of. It's not so much the concept of territorial integrity as it seems that the people's status as human beings is actually being challenged in the cases that I'm discussing.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
you're looking at situations where a portion of the population is then subjected to treatment which is disproportionate with the dignity that apportions to them as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So you can look.
So what is the distinction though between that and a mugging, right?
The only distinction is a distinction of scale.
Oh, okay. It's a mass mugging in your view.
Well, I mean, the only objection I would raise to that simile is that mugging is too mild of a word.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
you're not
I
just
don't know
taking
why I'm
somebody.
laughing, by the way, but
Right.
yeah.
Well, you're not just, taking their proverbial wallet, though you are because their material resources are expropriated. You're also raping and killing them. Okay, so it's really a full on psychopathic assault.
Yeah. So is this even war we are talking about, or what are we?
I guess what I'm actually suggesting is that
Violence is a broader category than war.
well, it is a broader category than war, but maybe, and I'm not consciously realizing this, but talking it out here, it almost seems to me as if war, as ugly as the term is, actually is a kind of euphemism to
Oh,
disguise
okay, okay.
the frank reality that this is what is witnessed when we talk about war. That certain people are organizing to, steal, rape, and kill certain other people, and they justify that through this narrative.
Yeah,
So
well,
maybe
if you're right, and I disagree that you are, but I mean, then just war is really an abominable concept, right?
right.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
I mean, I did state the case somewhat strongly right there,
yeah.
but
That's right. That's right.
but I would say not all too strongly, Tim. That because that's obviously my position. That just war is oxymoronic.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Okay.
It's a big question. It's a big question,
But
right? And I assume you're approaching it more from a pacifist angle than a realist angle.
well, they're kind of the same angle, aren't they? As we
In a way,
stated at the beginning of
but
the
a realist
program.
will still fight a war, right?
Right.
So they are rather
Well,
different in
but
practice.
but okay. So then the question becomes, who, what are we as human beings? I would say you could take someone like Henry Kissinger as an example of the realist par excellence, a man who countenanced the absolute devastation of Southeast Asia, the use of weapons whose consequences to this day ravage those people and their children and probably their children's children.
Right, right. Usually it's
Okay.
found on the side of generals, right, or heads of state, right.
Right. So are those
more than it is among philosophers, right? Although there are philosophers who are realists.
right? But that's the point is that if you're going to be real about philosophy, you're going to talk about how philosophy operates in the real world. Okay.
Yes, I
So
agree.
to be a
I agree.
philosophical realist, you're going to be somebody like Zbigniew Brzezinski, or Henry Kissinger, or Hillary Clinton, who really countenance these actually abominant behaviors. People who are willing to use nuclear weapons.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yes, I think
and
definitely you would call many of these people realists, right? In
and
varying
I'm
degrees.
saying that is not a normative way in which human beings should behave or encourage other human beings to behave. So the fact that a realist is willing to countenance the lunacy of warfare says to me that they are compromising their humanity. Now, I'm
Right,
not, I'm not,
right. I will have to depart in a minute, but
yeah, I know
let me
we're
just
coming up at.
let
I'll
me
give
see
you
if
the
I can
last
get
word.
the last word.
I will give you the last word.
What the
So.
realist might say is that in certain cases, if you do not follow a realist doctrine of war, there will be no humanity left to protect, right, or to talk about in
Yeah,
real
right.
world
Well.
radio shows, for that matter. But before we go,
I'm not going to say anything because I said that I was going to give you the last word.
Okay, you're not. Okay. Before we go, can I ask you who chided you for your editorial laugh?
Oh, I don't. A friend of mine, Richard Cisneros. I don't know if you know Richard or not, but
No, I
he was
don't.
listening to the show. So, and he said that was evident.
Well,
So.
I will be on the side of keep the editorial laugh.
So, right, I'm not. It's not going anywhere.
Okay,
so.
good. Well, nice to talk to you.
Yes,
Tom.
Tim. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
I didn't have to wear my helmet this time. Right?
How ironic.
But I was starting to put it on towards the end.
Right. Well, I'm not. It's not you with whom I have these these difficulties. So, but well, we'll have to leave it at that. I really want to say something, but I'm gonna exhibit moral restraint.
Yeah, we will save it for
So,
part two.
okay,
Part two.
alrighty then. Well, have a good day.
Yes, you too, Tom, and thanks for having me.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. So there we have it. We're coming up on the hour. So that's a little reprisal, a little consideration of some of the questions around war and so-called just war theory. And I guess, we can just go ahead and leave it out. Let me just remind everybody on I'm supposed to bookend the show with these disclaimers, but I often forget to do so. But today I'll remember to do this again. To remind everybody that WVQC is a community radio station, serves only to open its airwaves to responsible, divergent points of view. The opinions expressed on this program do not reflect the views of WVQC Media Bridges' staff or its board of trustees. The opinions expressed reflect the views of the programmer or their guests. Thank you for listening. Again, this is Thomas Lynn, and we have been speaking with Dr. Timothy Michael Conolly. This has been Radical Analysis, and hope you all have a good day. And once again, thank you for listening.